Hi, everyone. I'm so glad to be speaking today about accessibility, and I'm going to be talking specifically about how we can build inclusive and accessible web applications. My name is Egwuenu, and I'm a front-end engineer, a technical writer. I also like to call myself an accessibility advocate, and also I'm an Auth0 ambassador. You can learn more about me on my website, giftegwuenu.com. So the web as it is right now isn't accessible to everyone, and this becomes a barrier and it affects a lot of people, especially people with disabilities from accessing it. I really like this stats from the World Health Organization, and it's basically saying that over 1 billion people, or 15% of the entire world's population, experience some form of disability. So if you think about this for a minute, you can imagine the number of people that are having barriers from accessing the web. And basically what this talk is going to be about is showing you how you can build more accessible and inclusive web application. But before we dive into what web accessibility is and how you can implement or integrate it into your applications, I would like to talk a bit about disabilities. A disability is any continuing condition that restricts anyone from performing certain activities, and there are varying degrees of disability out there. It's even common for like two people to have the same disabilities but have different experiences. So how do we like quantify the different disabilities? I try to put them into these 4 categories. The first one being like permanent disability. So it could be that a person is deaf or hard of hearing, or a person that has color blindness, or a person with like cognitive disabilities like autism or dyslexia. It could also be a temporary disability, right? It could be that someone had an accident and as a result of that has like a broken arm. In that case, the person would like need extra help, or could only have access to use the keyboard to navigate the web. Or it could be someone has like eye injuries or hearing injuries. So these are like temporary disabilities. There is also situational disabilities, and this could happen to anyone, right? It could be that you're in a noisy environment, say you're in the marketplace and you need to like check out a video. If you're in that position and there is like no captions on your video, then obviously you're being barred from using that specific website at that particular moment. Or it could be that you're out in the bright sunlight and you're trying to like view an image on your phone, and because of low contrast you can't actually see it. There is also a case of you like having to multitask. For instance, I'm currently making breakfast, and I also need to check out something on the web. And yeah, if your website is not built to be accessible to me at that specific moment, it's what you're creating a blocker between me and your website at that point. And then lastly, there is also infrastructure barrier. What I like to call these are people that have like low internet connectivity or low bandwidth at a specific time. So it could be that you're in a position where you have low internet connectivity and you're trying to access a website or a web app. And at that point, because of this, you can actually see the images on the website. This could be because the images don't have like alt text, and because of that, you feel like you don't understand what is on that website. So this is also a barrier for people. So these are the several forms of disabilities. Now that we understand what people with disabilities encounter on a day-to-day basis, let's see how web accessibility can help fix this. What is web accessibility? It's fondly called ALI, which is like the short form. So it's A11y, and that is called a neural name. Web accessibility means that people with disabilities can equally perceive, understand, navigate, interact with your websites, technologies, or tools. Web accessibility is about removing the barriers so that people with disabilities can access your websites. The problem right now is that Many websites are not accessible, if we're being honest, and these websites has accessibility barriers that makes it difficult or impossible for people to use them. I really like this quote from Marcy Sutton. Marcy is an accessibility advocate, and she has done a lot of work educating folks about accessibility. And what she said really rings true for me. She said, accessibility is a lifestyle and a culture we all should cultivate. This is something we should think about, because a lot of people, companies, developers don't prioritize accessibility as much as we should have. I think I see like people prioritizing like performance, how fast is my web app, or what's the speed of my web app over accessibility, which should not be the norm. How does accessibility and inclusion fit together? Are they related? Do they mean the same thing, or are they totally different? Accessibility and inclusion, they are actually very closely related, and they are what makes the web work for everyone. Accessibility here means that you're building a web that includes people with disabilities, while I like to think about inclusion as you building a web that is usable to people with the widest possible range of abilities. So you're not just building your website specifically, or you don't just have, you're not prioritizing people with disabilities, but rather you're thinking of everybody. In that case, inclusion is about diversity and ensuring that everyone is involved. So here's a scenario. I have like these two images, and on the left, you can see a ramp for people that are using wheelchairs, right? This is a poorly designed ramp built specifically for people with disabilities. In my own opinion, I feel like somebody with disability trying to access this could think that, oh, I'm different, and they had to like build this specifically because of my inability to use a staircase. And that's not great, right? But on the right, you can see that there is this there's this well-designed stair and ramp. Is like, it has two functionalities. So you could use it as a ramp and also use it as a staircase. And it is built, this is what inclusion depicts. It's built with inclusivity in mind, and everyone can actually use it regardless of your ability. If you're using a wheelchair, you could use this. If you're using a baby stroller, you can use this. If you're riding a bike, you can also use this. So that's what I think about inclusion as. This is a more like explanatory illustration that I got from the Microsoft Inclusive Toolkit, and I really like what it is trying to show here. So we have like different senses, and there is the permanent disability, temporary disability, and the situational disability. And for touch, it could be that as a permanent disability, someone has like one arm, or it could be a temporary disability and you have like an arm injury, or you could be like a new parent carrying your baby. If you're in any of these cases, you would need to use a keyboard accessible. Say, for instance, you're trying to access a website. In any case, you'd need to use a keyboard accessible website at that point. When you try to use a website that is not keyboard accessible, what does it mean? It means that everybody in this case has been barred from using that website, and that's that's not what inclusion is about. So inclusion is about making sure everybody, regardless of their situation, can access the web. The same rings true for sight, hearing, and speaking. I have a cool story to tell. If you're active on Twitter, you would notice that last month Twitter released a new feature called Twitter Voice, and they did something that should have been corrected before releasing it. They shipped this feature without thinking about the hard of hearing or the deaf community, and they went on to call Twitter out. And this is a tweet from the head of design at Twitter. Here he's basically saying that he appreciates the feedback and the direct conversation about accessibility from the community, and that it is clear that they should have put in a lot of work to make sure that the feature is accessible to people before releasing it. and that he henceforth going forward he would advocate for accessibility to be part of the design. And then this other tweet from Twitter support saying that they are sorry for testing voice tweets without support for people who are visually impaired, deaf, or hard of hearing, that it was a miss to introduce this experiment without the support, and that accessibility should not be an afterthought. I really like the last statement there, because accessibility should not be an afterthought. That is true, because if they had like, I want to believe that they have like an accessibility team within Twitter. If they had made sure that the feature was accessible, because right now I will just show you what it looks like. This is what Twitter voice looks like right now. And if I'm a person with disability, say for instance I am deaf, or I can't really access this, I'll just, this is unusable for me because I can't actually, there's no transcript, right? So I can't actually use this feature. So what they said is they were going to work on it, but this is July and yet we've not seen any updates. What I'm just trying to get at is that we should show empathy for our users. Before releasing any products, we should make sure that it's usable to everybody, every user that would potentially use our website. So we should show empathy for our users. The business case for accessibility. As a business, should you actually care about accessibility, or you should just forget about it and go on with building your business? I don't think that is true. I think that it's a very important part of any business or any company. So what's in it for you as a business when you prioritize accessibility, aside from the fact that it is the right thing to do? So there are three major reasons I would like to highlight. The first one being that you will get to enhance your brand reputation. I just give an example of Twitter. If let's say there is a scenario that they release that feature with accessibility in mind, like the voice tweets also has like transcripts with it, that would have gotten them more rep from the hard on hearing community, because they would think that, okay, Twitter has them in mind. And that's just an example, right? It's not just okay for you or for a business to advocate for inclusion and diversity without actually doing the work and showing that they actually care. So if as a company or as a business, you actually prioritize that, the thing you get back in return, or the return in investment for you, is that you get to enhance your brand reputation. And then there is also the fact that you get to extend your market reach. I talked about over 1 billion people in the world identifying as people with disabilities, right? Imagine you just having like a fair market share from that number, because you went ahead to build, or because you prioritize accessibility in your development process. As a business, when you build for people with disabilities, you eventually get the largest market share in the market, because then they will all be happy with using your website or your web app. And then lastly, I think this one is what really triggers a lot of people to actually consider accessibility. It's to minimize legal risks. So there are laws backing accessibility right now. I mean, right now I know about the UK and the US, and some part of Europe has like accessibility laws. And if you're found wanting, it could lead to a lawsuit, or you can get sued. Here's an example of Beyonce. This actually happened. Beyonce was sued because her website was inaccessible to blind people. In order to avoid things like this, because I know that this might have cost her a lot of money to get out of that lawsuit. But yeah, it's an interesting story, and I think you should read it. Just to make sure that you avoid scenarios like this, it's great to always like build for accessibility, or build your website with accessibility before releasing it. So this is like a scenario for when you build an inaccessible app and it comes back to bite you. About 1 in 10 websites meet the accessibility standards. This, in my own opinion, is a very poor number. Imagine 10 websites and just 1 out of 10 websites is accessible or meets the accessibility standard. That's not great. And I feel like as a collective web, we could do better. And that's why it's good for people to advocate and speak about accessibility, so more people get to like collect that knowledge and actually integrate it into the application. I'm not just talking about losses here or bad cases of accessibility. There are also accessibility wins. And this is from Gatsby.js. So this is a tweet from Marcy. Marcy is a software developer, software engineer at Gatsby. She tweeted that WebAIM Million is an annual accessibility analysis of the top 1 million websites on the web. So they carry out this analysis every year. And Gatsby came out as one of the fewest websites with the smallest number of errors. So that's a big win for them because they've gone ahead to like prioritize accessibility in their community. So I think that's a big win for Gatsby.js. How do you ensure high standards of accessibility? There are 4 things that I would like to recommend if you want to actually improve or ensure that you have high standards of accessibility. The first one being that you should craft, as a company, as an individual, or a small team, you should craft an accessibility statement. Basically, this will help show that you're committed to all your users, and it's a good move for your organization or for your company. Then you should develop a plan for implementing accessibility. Go ahead, and it's not just saying I'm going to implement accessibility. You just keep saying you're going to do it, or you just keep keeping it at the end of your to-do list, and you go on to ship your application, and then you forget to implement it. It shouldn't be that way. Accessibility should be part of the development process. So create a strategy for implementing fundamental accessibility features into your products. And another way is to have like a checklist. So make sure that you have like, if you have a checklist already, ensure to add accessibility items onto that checklist. Or if you don't, just create an accessibility checklist, like things that you should have before shipping your product. And then lastly, this is something I think everybody, as long as we are building for the web, should prioritize, is to educate and advocate for accessibility. It could be that you're the only person working on the team that advocates or educates people, but you shouldn't stop. Just keep going, and you don't know if other people will also adopt what you're doing in your team. Moving on, I would like to talk about the guidelines, accessibility guidelines. So W3C, together with the Web Accessibility Initiative, came together to publish a set of guidelines, a set of accessibility guidelines. Basically, these are recommendations for how you can actually build more accessible websites for people. There are 3 different guidelines. The first one is the ACAG, Authoring to Accessibility Guidelines, and this is mainly focused for people, content creators, or people building software for content creation. Say, for instance, CMSs, or if you have a blog, authors and bloggers. Yeah, this is built specifically for those groups. Then WCAG, which is the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. This is focused on the web. So it generally refers to like information on your website. It could be like images, sound, markup, and code. Then lastly, there is the UCAG. It's like User Agent Accessibility Guidelines. It is specifically for browsers, browser extension, media players, and assistive technologies. But for this talk, I'm just going to be focused on the second one, which is Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. The WCAG, which is fondly called like the Web Accessibility Guidelines, which is fondly called WCAG, is a set of principles that guides us as web developers to make or to build more accessible websites. And there are 4 principles. They're called like the PAW principles. The first one is that for every website you build, you should make sure that it is perceivable. What does this mean? It means that the information or the components must be presentable to users in ways that they can perceive. This could be like adding captions to your audio or your video, making your content easier for people to read. And the second one, which is that your website should be operable. It means that users can find and use content regardless of how they choose to access it. So I could decide to just use my mouse or to navigate your website, or I could decide to use the tab key to navigate, the keyboard to navigate your website, and they both should work, right? So when you're able to like have like functionality available for keyboard, and the content on your website does not cause like seizures. If you have so many animation, there should be like an option to like turn it off or reduce it. When you're meeting all these standards, it means that your website is operable. The next one is that your website should be understandable, meaning that information and operation should be understandable. So if you have text, your text should be readable. It shouldn't be too small, or the color contrast should be acceptable. And then lastly, your content or your website should be robust. What does this mean? It means that it can be interpreted with a wide range of user agents, technologies, including like screen readers. There is also something that I'd like to point out, which is called the WCAG conformance levels. These are basically standards created by the WCAG group that everybody should try to meet. So there are 3 different levels. There is the level A, which is like the minimum level you can get to. There is the double A, which is the middle level, and this is like industry standard. So this is where you should aim to be at. And then lastly, there's triple A level. Triple A, this is the highest level of conformance. So in building your web applications and checking, just to make sure that you are following the proper guidelines, you could check the levels. Say if you are reaching level A, that's great. Aim for level AA. If you're reaching level AA, it means that you're both reaching level A and level AA. That's also great. Aim for the next level. And this is an image that I found that I feel like would really hit home and explain what I have been saying so far. Is this image really accessible, or is this scenario really accessible? This is an image of an acroid, like it's called Australian Council for Rehabilitation of Disabled Parking Bay. So it's meant for, this is a parking slot meant for people with disabilities, but there's a crate there obstructing it. If somebody wants to park, or if a person with disability wants to park in this space, they can't because there is like an obstruction. This image directly relates to how we use the web. If a person with disability is trying to access your website and there are obstructions or there are blockers that can't allow them use it, they leave and they find something else, and you don't want that for your users, right? So what can we do as a collective web to make our websites more accessible? The first thing I would like to suggest is that you add text alternative for non-text content. So if you have images or GIFs on your website, make sure that you have like an alt text that is very descriptive. Don't just add like image, or don't just add cop. Make sure it's something that when the screen reader is going through it, the user can actually understand what that image is describing. And then the next one is visible focus styles. I see a lot of people like trying to remove focus, and I don't know why. So the focus is meant for keyboard users so that I can actually tap through your website, and instead of using like a mouse, right? But at the end of the day, a lot of people turn it off, like using the outline non styling, which shouldn't be. It shouldn't be that way. Instead, you should make it visible. You could decide to customize it to fit your theme or your website theme, but don't turn it off. Don't take it out. Make sure that your website is make sure that I can navigate through your website and that is visible. I just want to show you an example here. I think the WebAIM website is a very interesting example of how this should work. So I will just show you what I mean. They added like a very cool animation to the focus of their website. So if I'm moving through the website, you can see how elegantly, it flows straight. So this is something you can also integrate in it, but can also integrate in your website, but you shouldn't take it out. Then something else you can do to improve accessibility is by making sure that you meet the standards of color contrast. So on your website, make sure that text should have a ratio of 4.5 to 1. I have this demo here that I would show you. So I have these two boxes here. Obviously, the first one, you have to like strain your eyes to be able to see the text that's written there. That is because the foreground and the background color contrast don't match. On the other hand, the other box that I have has like great color contrast. So the background and the foreground color really looks great. Out of the wide, I was just going on to like look for websites that I could use for my demo to just show you um, live websites that are not meeting some of this. And I found one very popular one, the Orange websites, which is Hacker News. Everybody knows Hacker News. I used the Axe web extension to just try and check if they are meeting all the standards or if they're actually trying to. And I found out that they have over 237 errors saying that they have like low sufficient color contrast. And I'll just show you what the problem here is. The problem here is that if I navigate through, you'd see that Axe is showing me where the problems are. So basically, the color, they're using a gray color on a gray background, which is very low. I have this very cool tool for checking contrast, and I'm just, okay, I already checked it here. I'm just going to go ahead and check the contrast between these two just to show you just to show you the score. It should fail actually. I don't know. Yeah, I did this earlier on and it failed because the color contrast between this text and the background wasn't so great, and it gave me like a better color to use to fix it, which I think I applied. That's why it's not working. But yeah, that's just an example of when there is low contrast. So somebody that has like color blindness and is trying to access this website could find that there is like barriers for them because they might find that some of these texts are quite small for them to view, or they can actually see some of the text on this website. Then something else that you could do is adding skip links to your website. What does this do? It helps you like skip content. So if you don't want to, if you're using the keyboard or you're using voiceover and you don't want to go through each navigation, you can just use the skip to content. You can add it to your website and it's easy for your users to skip to the main content of the website. I have examples here. The BBC homepage did a very good job of adding this. So if I'm tabbing through it, you see that I get the skip to content and I can just use it. It also applies to this website, gov.uk. There's so many examples, and I'm so glad that while checking out websites for this, I saw a lot that already has it implemented. So that is good. Then something else that you should have in mind is to always use semantic HTML. I see a lot of people using div for everything. It shouldn't be that way. I mean, you are already provided with semantic HTML like button and the button tag, but yes, you go on to use div to build out a button. It shouldn't be that way. If you're building a button, like the example that I have here shows, the first example is just a button. I get focus by default. But if I'm using div, if I'm using a div to display a button, then I have to go ahead and add some area attributes. For instance, to make it focusable, I have to add tab index of 0. I also have to add the area role of button. This is just like extra steps to get the same thing. So why not just build with semantic elements? In a case where I know that there might be cases where you need to build like a custom drop down or something, then that's fine. But make sure that you're adding area attributes so that when the users like voice over, when a user is using voiceover and is trying to access your website, they get audio cues for what is on your website. Then something else I'd like to point out is to add like specify the language attributes. I think if you're doing like if you're writing HTML, a lot of people omit this, but it shouldn't be that way. If you're building a website that is the main language for it is English, make sure that you have like the lang attribute. If it's French, make sure you also have like the lang attribute for French, so that when a person with disability is trying to access your website, the assistive technologies that you're using will read the language out in the default language. So if it's English, it reads it out in English. If it's French, it does the same for French. And then lastly, make sure that you provide captions or transcripts for your media content. I have like 2 examples here. This is YouTube. I think both of them are actually YouTube. On YouTube, you have this caption option that you could turn on if, for instance, in a situational scenario, you're in a noisy environment and you just want to listen to, or you don't want to listen to the audio, you can just read the caption. Or for a user with hard-on hearing or a deaf user, they could also use this feature conveniently. So those are some accessibility tips that you could use on your website going forward. Also, I would like to point out some auditing tools. I mentioned Axe earlier because I use Axe. I also use Lighthouse. But these are some tools you could use for auditing and debugging accessibility on your website. There is Lighthouse, Screen Readers, Wave, Axe, Accessibility Insights, and you can also write automated tests with Cypress, which is really great as well. This is the web accessibility lifecycle. This is something I coined the term, but as a team, as a business, if you're trying to integrate accessibility, I think these are 4 steps that you'd like to, or 4 activities you would like to incorporate into your process. The first one is to initiate. So now you understand the importance of accessibility. Going forward, you want to make sure that your website is accessible. The first thing you need to do is initiate that conversation, like have an understanding of what you need to do, how large is your system, and how long will the process take. So you can just have that initial conversation with your team, and then the next step would be to plan. So create a plan of how you want to like implement accessibility. If you need to assign a budget or if you need to assign a specific team to work on it, this is the stage where you will do that. The next stage is to implement. So this is now where you develop, you integrate and evaluate accessibility on your website. So after implementing this, the last step, which is actually not the last step because I see this as a continuous progress. It just keeps going on and on and on. The last step is to sustain, like make sure you have like a system that allows you make continuous improvements, and you can go on and repeat the process to ensure high level of accessibility in your website, your web app, or in your company. So to summarize everything that I've said, I talked a bit about disabilities and how it affects our users, how accessibility and inclusion are related. I still went on to speak about the business case for accessibility. We saw how Twitter voice feature was shipped without accessibility. We also saw how Gatsby went on to like improve accessibility and they got recognized for it. I also spoke about WCAG principles and talked a bit about how you can actually implement accessibility, ways you can audit and debug, and then the accessibility lifecycle. I'd like to end this talk with this quote from Tim Berners-Lee. who is like the director of the W3C and the inventor, obviously, the inventor of the World Wide Web. He said, the power of the web is in its universality. Access by everyone, regardless of their disability, is an essential part. I feel that accessibility should not be a checklist, or it shouldn't just be a standard that you set within your team, but rather it should be about the people that you're building it for. You should make sure that you're actually building to improve people's experiences on the web. And then lastly, it shouldn't just be one person's job. It should be the team, it should be a collective team effort, like everybody from the designers to the developers to the product managers are all involved in the process. So let's all do the right thing and make sure that we make efforts to allow the web be accessible and inclusive to everyone. Thank you.